Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen im Kreisky-Forum. In kleiner Runde, aber wir freuen uns besonders, dass Sie an so einem wunderschönen sonnigen Abend zu uns gefunden haben. Zu einem hoffentlich sehr interessanten Gespräch, das auf Englisch stattfinden wird. Accountability and Environmental Justice in the War of the Ukraine. An der Stelle wechsle ich gleich auf Englisch und freue mich ganz herzlich, begrüßen zu dürfen Leonard de Klerk, who's joining us from Hungary. He's Dutch-born, but has a long 25-year-old career as an environmental technician expert in former Eastern Europe. Spent a lot of time in Ukraine itself, and I'm very happy to say has been among the first people who took the initiative to start documenting and map the environmental damage and environmental harms that are incurred as a result of the Russian aggression and the war on the Ukraine. On that note, it's very important for me to say, when we focus on environmental issues tonight, this is of course completely not in disregard of any of the human suffering and tremendous social and political consequences inflicted upon the Ukrainian people. But it is also a fact that the environment for a very long time, and up until now arguably, has received very little attention as another victim of war. And just today it happened, I'm also teaching at the Academy of Applied Arts as part of a human rights program, where we had this lecture on the environment as a victim of war and how little international law, humanitarian law, all the conventions we have about proper conduct in times of war have really paid attention to the environment as such, up to a point where there's actually no specific legally binding international framework that would allow us to hold aggressors, war aggressors, to account for the long-lasting, and it really is the scope of time and the unpredictability, the unforeseeable consequences of environmental damages in war that are of utmost concern and are by and large sitting still in a gray legal area. And so it's on that note that I'm very happy that we have you here, Leonard. He will start by giving us a brief overview on what is known now in terms of harms inflicted upon the environment, to give us a perspective on not only what has happened, but what it will take for the environment, for animals and all species and plants, including humans, to recover. But I'm also very happy to welcome Stavros Pantazopoulos, and I'm sorry I have to read this because I'm not born Greek, so forgive me, who is joining us from Athens, but actually has many professional affiliations, one of which is the University of Helsinki, where he's part of a research framework as a legal scholar and legal expert on toxic crimes, another research project dedicated specifically to environmental war crimes and the scope of possibilities and strategies adopted by activists, civilians on the ground, including governments, in not just the Ukraine, but most certainly also Ukraine. But he's also teaching and researching at the University of Athens, and in Amsterdam. You're also an affiliated scholar. Which institute?
National Institute, yeah.
Okay. So after the presentation, kicking off with Leonard, after his presentation, we will then engage in a dialogue from what we know, what Leonard presents to us, what does it mean in terms of several attempts to put Vladimir Putin or the Russian state to court. What are the legal frameworks? What are the practical or the geopolitical obstacles towards this? What are the challenges really in documenting this and the political economy of data collection? We will engage in a dialogue and discussion about this. But Leonard, please, if I could invite you to take up the board and give us an overview to get us started. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And what I will just try to do to kick off the discussion is give you a little bit of an an overview of what we are talking about in terms of environmental damage. And of course, you should understand the war is still ongoing, and a lot of information is simply not available because part of Ukraine is occupied. But during quite quickly after the start of the full-scale invasion of Russia, Ukraine already decided to start documenting damages being done to the country. Damages being done to the civilian infrastructure, buildings, roads, factories, but also trying to document the damage being done to the environment. And the leading ministry is the Ministry of Environmental Protection of Ukraine. And very soon, or very quickly, they've set up a website, but also launched an application that people could download. And using this application, they could immediately transmit damages to the environment, like oil leakages, making pictures, and submit this to the ministry. I'm just showing you here the dashboard as it was yesterday. So the Ukrainian government estimates that the current environmental damage is approximately 15 billion euros. And they're looking to different categories. For example, air is a big one from fires from oil depots, for example. Pollution of soil is important because, as we all know, Ukraine is a very industrialized country where the industry is concentrated in the east of the country, in the Donbass, and that's exactly where most of the war and the hostilities are taking place. Is it? Oh, yeah. But also water. I'll give you some examples. There is a lot of forest in the west of Ukraine, but also where the front at the moment is. And because of the shelling, we've seen a lot of damage being done to forest. Here you see a map. This is a map from Greenpeace, and also here they are recording incidents to the environment, and you very nicely can see, you know, where the front line has been over the year, but also with rockets, ballistic rockets, they've done damage to the west of Ukraine. One of the prime targets of Russia is the energy infrastructure, oil depots. For example, this is an oil depot very close to Kiev that was hit in the early days of the war. As this area never got occupied, they had the possibility to survey the damage. And unfortunately, you know, the oil, you can see the oil just either got burnt or leaked into the soil, and through the groundwater it reached small fishing ponds where you know, fish simply perished because of the oil pollution. This is a map of Azovstal in Mariupol, and just to give you an impression of the size, so this is the city of London. And this is the area also of Azovstal. It's a huge facility built in the Soviet Union. Basically, has been completely destroyed because the war was going on there for weeks, you know, it's under occupation, so we can't survey it. But thanks to satellite technology, we at least can have a look from space what is happening. And as you can see here, the different facilities, substations, tanks, blast furnace, etc., you know, have been destroyed. This is the area around Mykolaiv, Mykolaiv was not occupied, but it's in between Odessa and Kherson. And because of the hostilities, also again an oil depot was hit, but also some military warehousing. And the water got very much polluted, and this is a source for drinking water in Mykolaiv. And as a result, Mykolaiv, until recently, did not have any drinkable water available. Nuclear, and that's a new one too. I mean, Ukraine, 50% of the electricity is produced by nuclear energy. And here you see the four working facilities, and one, the Zaporizhzhia, which is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, is under occupation. Thank God nothing has happened, but we all know there is a counteroffensive plant going to happen probably in this region. So we hope that nothing will happen here as well. And this is a map of the forest fires, which were also monitored by satellite. And you have three different colors. The red one has always been occupied. The yellow one is the combat zone, and the blue one has never been occupied by Russia. But you can clearly see, along the front line where the fires have been. But also in the west of the country, because a lot of firefighters went to the front, are working at the front line. So there is no one available to extinguish natural fires. And last, and that's something that I've been looking into, is the greenhouse gas emissions caused by this war, because because of the fires, for example. But also the warfare, the military uses an awful lot of fossil fuel, which converts into greenhouse gases. And we've estimated that for the first 7 months of the war, about 100 million tons of CO2 was emitted into the atmosphere additionally. And to compare that, that's the same amount what the Netherlands emits in a 7 months period as well. I was talking about the ministry, but there are many NGOs and organizations that try to help and document environmental damage, and I've just listed here a couple of them. So it's the Ecozagroza is the website from the ministry, but there is in the UK the Conflict of Environment Observatory, EcoAction, it's a Ukrainian NGO, and the Zoe Network in Switzerland, which are very active in documenting what's happening at the moment.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. I would like to pick you up precisely on the question of actors. So these are kind of the main organizations involved in data collection, but like you said, the Ministry of Environment launched an application. There's a dedicated website for civilians, for every citizen of the Ukraine, being able to report another incident, a fire, an explosion somewhere. Yet from my own experience, having lived in Lebanon, not including during times of war, what I know from similar situations, that is many people start collecting data, and we end up with many different data sets that are never joined, much less verified to a standard where we can say we then have one comprehensive damage assessment, but rather it fragments out, everyone using their database to generate funding from international organizations. What is sort of the bigger picture here in the Ukraine? To what extent are people actually coordinating? And how is that complicating the process of verification, which is obviously the most important one?
No, definitely. I mean, important to understand that Ukraine has a very strong NGO, civil society. So that's why it's so, a lot of the documentation goes through NGOs and civil society. It goes, you could say it is a bit going chaotic at the moment. Everybody is doing his or her best. But there is definitely some coordination with the ministry. So there are certain methodologies how we can, compare the different damages. But, the war is still ongoing, and I think now it's very important that we document what is happening, and really the verification and making sure this is also material that can be used in legal proceedings is definitely something that I believe should be done after the war is over.
Mm. And I think a related question to both of you, being having been involved for one in researching civil society activism along with legal activism in times of war or after conflict, with the aim of filing lawsuits or claiming compensation. What are the main obstacles in this documentation? Is it access? You mentioned Mariupol. I reckon in areas occupied by Russia, it's next to impossible to establish a comprehensive documentation. But what other obstacles are these activists facing at the moment?
Manpower. The scale of damages is so massive that there are simply not enough people to document it. And like I said, many men are fighting at the front, also from the ministries, but also from NGOs. And they simply, don't have the capacity to go there to all those locations, because if you really want to properly document it, you can't do it with satellite data only. I mean, if you're talking about soil pollution, you can't see that through a satellite. You have to go there and take samples, for example. At some case, it's not safe, even if it's controlled by the Ukrainian government. It's not so safe to go there.
And from your experience, Stavros?
No, I would definitely second these concerns and remarks. I would also like to bring up the issue of the political economy of funding. Also, it's about the priorities of funding organizations. This could also entail, for example, some competing interests, competition over the same pool of available money. And of course, what you both mentioned before, it is about the methodologies. Recently, there was an effort by the International Criminal Court and Eurojust. They issued together a joint publication on some guidelines on how NGOs or individuals could contribute to their work. Of course, it was not about environmental crimes per se or environmental wrongdoing. It was generally about crimes because, as you mentioned, you could collect all this evidence, and in the end, it could not be usable. So these organizations provided these guidelines how to verify what are the standards, what are the thresholds, and it seems that the international community, or at least these international judicial or prosecutorial bodies, they're going to contribute in their own way. So, but this, the civil society has to follow, and this also poses some challenges.
Mm-hmm. And when you speak about political economy of funding and priorities or special interests playing in there, can you elaborate maybe for the audience? I think not everyone will be aware of the situation.
Yes, so it's about coordination, of course, and especially in the Ukrainian context, many organizations, international organizations and agencies, of course, after February 22, after the full-scale invasion, they were much more interested in what's happening in Ukraine, and of course, based on their mandate, they would also prioritize their funding. And this, in a great way, shapes the manner civil society organizations, NGOs, document environmental harms. This is what I mentioned before, and even if, I don't know, you have a civil society organization wanting to focus, for example, on debris that has been produced because of the hostilities, if the international agencies, UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, or UN or UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, are not interested in this, and this is a hypothetical example, then they will also have to change, the civil society organizations will have to change their strategies. And in a sense, this also shapes the way they operate. This is what I meant when I talked about the political economy of the funding landscape.
And of course, the situation only got more complicated because we know not only do we have climate awareness now, so CO2, I think it's the first war that you are studying in terms of CO2 emissions, but we are also very much aware about dying species, loss of biodiversity, etc. And Ukraine having 35% of Europe's biodiversity and very precious soils adds an additional kind of documentation and monitoring challenge. Is the funding landscape even prepared for this? Documenting landmines, etc., debris, like you say, or oil spills, the institutions have come to terms with that and there are funding schemes established. But when it comes to CO2, biodiversity loss, where are we at that in terms of institutional support for documenting and recovery, most importantly?
Well, you know, so talking about the CO2 emissions, so that's basically what my team is doing at the moment. You know, indeed, it was the first time that this was ever done of a conflict, to really look at a comprehensive. I mean, it has been done in the previous conflicts at a limited scale. So, for example, in the Iraq conflict, they've looked into Iraq destroyed a lot of oil wells, and there were quite a lot of CO2 emissions from the destruction. But what we are really trying to do is to look at the overall impact. So not only of the military action itself, but also looking into how many emissions will there be for the reconstruction of the destroyed civilian infrastructure. And honestly speaking, so we started as a voluntary organization, just with individuals working on Excel sheets. And when we initially approached funders, they said, well, but is this really a priority? Again, because of the human catastrophe. And I don't, the answer I got, you know, the Ukrainians probably would not be interested in climate change at this moment. They have bigger problems. But when we approached people for data, they were very forthcoming. So we work together with the Kiev School of Economics, which is aggregating damages being done to the civilian infrastructure. The project is called Russia Will Pay. And they were very forthcoming. They were eager to help us in doing the job. So when we finally managed to do a first assessment and presented it at the climate conference in Egypt, then the funding organizations realized, okay, this is indeed something interesting, and they were willing to fund it.
And just on a side note, I would reckon even as an interim situation, a situational awareness, so to speak, would be quite important, because we know, for instance, from countries like India, where the cooking stove, where cooking is very much still happening in the open air because of the lack of electricity, it's the major contributor to air pollution and not least CO2. And I imagine in a war situation, when your house is bombed down, there's a lot of open fire for all sorts of purposes. Yeah. To support the civilian population on that level, to kind of at least keep CO2 levels in check. So I think it's a very important initiative, and on that note, thank you for this. But thinking ahead, so now we are collecting what we can. Verification will follow up once the fighting hopefully has stopped very soon. What is the bigger picture? What is the bigger plan, or what are possible scenarios how this data could be used if it's indeed archived in a proper way? What is the purpose? To hold Russia to account, to prepare evidence for a possible trial, or is it just to have a basis for future funding applications, etc.?
Well, I think the first purpose is to have an understanding where the damage is, and to enable Ukraine to prioritize the cleanup, because you know, the damage is so big, and Ukraine will have to prioritize. So initially, making sure at least that the worst damages are contained, that they don't spread. But I guess that the priorities of Ukraine, of course, is to rebuild the country, provide people housing for refugees when they are returning. So at least to have a good overview is to enable policymakers to, you know, where we're going to prioritize our cleanup efforts.
And I guess stabilization.
From the side of the international community, the United Nations General Assembly, at least, has decided, did so in November 22, that the end outcome should be compensation pursued by Ukraine for the wrongdoing of Russia in and or against Ukraine, as the resolution goes. And the first step would be to create a register for damage. So this is the first step, and the ultimate objective is to secure compensation for all wrongdoing. Against this background, the Council of Europe is very active, and actually this was a recommendation on behalf of the United Nations General Assembly, and it seems that the Council of Europe is willing to take up this recommendation and to make it happen in reality. Many member states have coalesced, and it appears that in the coming days, actually in less than a week, the register for damage would be officially launched. The next summit is in Reykjavik next week, but many quarters are optimistic that they will announce the official launch of the register before that. And actually Austria is contributing a lot towards this objective. Within the scope of this register, there is an explicit resolution that environmental damage should be included, should be documented. The idea, the underlying rationale, is to coordinate and promote evidence gathering. And as we mentioned, this is the first step. Environmental wrongdoing seems to be, to form part and parcel of this initiative. So this is what I see from the side of the international community and from the side of Europe from a more regional perspective.
And if we have reasons to be proud of Austria, we are very happy, of course, to do so. Can you elaborate on what level is Austria very active, on the level of ministry? Or?
From what I understand, at the state level, and it seems that they would also contribute to the budget, the annual budget. The headquarters will be at The Hague, the Netherlands, but of course there will be a branch in Kyiv. The annual budget, from what I read today, actually, in the morning, should be 8 million euros, the starting budget. And Austria, my understanding is that it will contribute meaningfully to this initiative.
That's very wonderful to hear, because we have this discussion here as a neutral country. What's our role in this conflict? It's a perfect example where neutral countries can lead the way in supporting on a non-armor, non-weaponry basis. So we are very happy to know this. But thinking ahead, a registry documentation, and maybe can we do this? Can we post these guidelines? Because this is really a critical point, how to archive we never know, Austrians are supporting Ukraine on many levels. Maybe we can publish these guidelines on the webpage for everyone to be in the picture. But when we look at the legal situation, and it's actually quite exceptional that the UN passes a resolution for evidence during an active conflict to be documented. From my knowledge, the last time this happened was when the then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and burned up oil fields. But these are the two cases I know where on an international level it was a general joint commitment to document and seek compensations. In general, where are we in terms of legal frameworks? Why is this not standard practice in the first place?
It's very difficult for states, of course, to agree at this level. So we have different frameworks in place. The laws of war, and you mentioned this before, Monika, are quite limited to this respect. The natural environment does not feature properly within this framework, the laws of armed conflict. So it is very difficult to mobilize this framework. It appears to me, and this actually was the practice with the Iraqi invasion and occupation of Kuwait in the early 90s, that alone the use of force is the most appropriate framework, to put it simply, pursuing a war of aggression. And the following damages, including environmental damages, are attributable to the aggressor state, for our purposes, the Russian Federation. This was the route taken back in the early 90s, and actually back then it was a resolution by the United Nations Security Council, no veto back then by the Russian Federation. We have to recall that it was at the end of the Cold War. There was the promise of this liberal international order where the rule of law, international cooperation, development would prevail. Of course, disillusionment occurred in the early 2000s after 9/11, but at least for this decade, states, and especially the Security Council, were quite active. Part of their efforts were to establish the United Nations Compensation Commission to adjudicate claims flowing from the illegal occupation and invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. Of course, this is not forthcoming nowadays. Russia would never agree to such a resolution, would definitely veto something of this type. It's unique in this respect. The institution of the UN Compensation Commission was very unique. On the other hand, we can build on its work when it comes to environmental claims, adjudicating claims, issues of evidence, issues of causation. We can definitely draw on its work. But again, I think it's important to highlight that all this was built around the war of aggression, the illegal invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. And perhaps this is the path that we should pursue also nowadays. Laws of war, again, in my view, do not hold significant promise to this end. That's how I would interpret it.
But in terms of balance and fairness, one needs to say the US invasion of Iraq was also never subject to any compensation claims, but probably because it was labeled as a regime change, stabilization kind of operation, and not as a war of aggression, even on UN level. But just to balance out that inconsistencies occur across the board. But even if we can build on this precedent, what actually qualifies as environmental damage subject to such a compensation commission or any possible tribunal at a later stage?
Back then, the findings of this quasi-judicial body, because it was not a judicial body per se adjudicating, it was not litigation-oriented, it was more a claims facilitation, claims resolution body, the United Nations Compensation Commission. So back then, the main types of environmental damage that were deemed to be eligible for compensation would be, for example, the depletion of natural resources, cleanup or restoration, reasonable cleanup or restoration costs, or, for example, monitoring and assessing the costs that had to be remediated. So these were the main types of environmental damage deemed to be compensable under the framework of the United Nations Compensation Commission. And of course, it is interesting to note that many different categories of persons could submit claims. For example, it could relate to claims coming from individual laws, states' laws, international organizations, the costs they had incurred in order to remediate environmental damage, and of course, corporations. On the last note, the United Nations Compensation Commission was also, there was a criticism levied against it, that the familiar criticism of victor's justice, because most of the claimants were either of American or Kuwaiti nationality. And we have to also to bear this in mind on the way forward.
Mm. And just to give you a figure, yeah? Dann schalten wir es aus.
Bitte, würde ich
ja.
Ich fühle mich angesprochen.
Ja, nee, absolut. Die brauchen wir nicht.
Sie strahlen nicht mehr als ohne. Ja?
Danke für den Hinweis. Dankeschön. Und wenn wir schon bei Zahlen und Sparen sind, just to give you a dimension, I think the initial number of claims filed to the Kuwait Compensation Commission was 2.5 billion. and processed and administered were 1.5 billion cases, and they paid out $52 billion. So you can see the geopolitics of compensation commissions and claims, but it is important at least we have a precedent to lean on. But what also shines through from what you're saying is they were focusing on business-related loss very much related to oil or in fact, quantifiable damage. Then when we look at what we see in the Ukraine, it's much harder to quantify all the different types of damage that have happened there, right? Well, do you have any insights what mechanisms or methods people actually built on?
Well, the Ukrainian Ministry or the State Environmental Inspectorate has adopted in 3 decrees certain methodologies how the damages are being are to be calculated. The basis of damages is how much will it cost to mitigate the damages and to reinstate it into its original situation before the war. When it comes to, for example, oil pollution, okay, you would have to, take away the ground, clean it, and put it back. If it's about diversity loss, for example, in forests, it's very difficult to reinstate it, even not to talk about how much, would it cost. So it's one should be careful in just translating environmental damages just in a monetary value, because a lot of cannot be put in monetary value, and unfortunately, some environmental loss will never, cannot be repaired.
Mm-hmm. So we will see, but also they factor in then the reparation work, because Azovstal we talked about before. We have many toxic tailing ponds, meaning ponds with toxic chemicals coming out of the industrial plant, sitting right next to an ocean. All these toxic chemicals, of course, need to be stabilized, but eventually decommissioned and rehabilitated in a safe and sound way. All that I reckon will be figured into the calculations of the ministry, right?
Yes, but specifically of Azovstal, and actually there are two plants in Mariupol. The first question, of course, would be, will they rebuild Azovstal? And honestly speaking, I doubt that they will, because it's such a massive complex. So. There would be then limited interest, at least from the business environment, to clean up the mess, because it's only going to be a cost, and there won't be any benefits for Azovstal. And here comes, of course, into picture that a lot of industry and Ukraine inherited a lot of Soviet. Built industry. Pollution has been a topic for Ukraine for a very long time, and then the war, makes it even more uncontrollable. We'll have to see. The war is not over, and for the moment we just can hope that, for example, such a tailing point. So a tailing point is a reservoir of toxic industrial waste, and in the case of Azovstal, it's just separated with a dam from the Azov Sea, the Sea of Azov. So if there is any rocket hitting the dam, the toxic waste will simply flow into the Sea of Azov, and that will be a catastrophe. Let's hope it won't happen.
On a good note, we can say that last year at the UN level, a new set of principles was passed or adopted, the PERAC principles, the protection of environment in conflict areas, which for the first time specifies in much more detail than ever before, code of conduct in relation to the environment by warring parties. And areas like Azovstal would certainly be a case for, it asks for special protection zones to be created around very specific sensitive areas, like a nuclear power plant for sure. Excuse me. But industrial facilities, also natural protected areas, a lot of the specially protected natural resorts have actually been affected by the war. These principles, like so many UN resolutions, are of course not binding, right? But the question then to you, Stavros, is where does the negligence to adopt even minimum standards of even common sense, I do not conduct in active battle in and around a nuclear power plant, because in the worst case, it kills not just my enemy, but myself, or natural resources. Where do violations or neglect against such common sense principles feature in the list of war crimes, for instance, and possible prosecutable crimes in the catalogue of international law?
Yes, so to start with, the laws of war not necessarily entailing individual criminal responsibility, commission of war crimes, etc. There are a couple of provisions which were adopted in 1977 in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and having in mind already the experience of Second World War. So there is a type of special protection prescribed when it comes to hostilities taking place at the vicinity, or of course attacks against nuclear generating facilities. The threshold is high, to be honest. The protection seems to be the level of protection seems to be adequate, but nevertheless, there are still some exceptions. When it comes now to protected zones, this is an area where legal protection is definitely below acceptable level. And natural reserves, biodiversity, hotspots, etc. It rests with the consent, the agreement, it rests with the discretion of the belligerent states to conclude a special agreement affording special protection to these areas. So we are definitely lagging behind in this respect. And to a certain extent, it is understandable given when these conventions, treaties were adopted late 70s, which of course showcases the need for an elaborate and renewed framework. Turning now to war crimes, the commission of international crimes. In general, the statute of the International Criminal Court indeed contains a provision on the so-called environmental war crime. There is a specific reference to causation of environmental damage. Nevertheless, the threshold is too high. Actually, many people consider this one, many experts, it is impracticable. It will never be applied in practice. The threshold has been set too high. So we have to rely on other provisions, on the commission of other crimes. For example, destruction of the environment, environmental wrongdoing, as a means of or as a result of committing other international crimes. For example, it could be the case poisoning water wells in order, of course, to cause civilian deaths. This could be such an example. But again, as you can see, there is no environment-specific provision, which is, of course, could provide realistic chances of protection. We have to rely on other provisions, on other mechanisms in order to identify these wrongdoings.
And when you say the threshold is too high, can you elaborate? What do you mean?
Yes, so when it comes to this, the environmental war crime, as we tend to call it, first, it applies only to international armed conflicts, in other words, interstate wars, which is fine for our purposes. Ukraine versus Russia, it is an international armed conflict. On the other hand, the threshold is too high in the sense that it enshrines a triple cumulative threshold. The damage has to be long-lasting, plus severe, plus widespread. And of course, okay, these terms could be interpreted in a way that we could imagine some environmental wrongdoing happening right now in Ukraine to fit within the scope of this provision. Nevertheless, the understanding is that by definition, by design, states have interpreted these terms to be quite high. For example, when it comes to long-lasting, according to the mainstream interpretation, it has to be at least 1 decade long, this damage, which of course also proves poses many obstacles when it comes to proving this type of harm. You have at least to wait for 10 years, right? So you cannot properly rely on this. And actually this provision has never been employed so far in the practice of the International Criminal Court.
There is, for a long time now, this proposal to establish ecocide, to include it in the Rome Statute and establish ecocide, the knowing destruction of environments, not only during war times, could be a corporate crime as well, but despite better knowledge or even willfully causing widespread destruction to an environment as destroying the value of the environment in and of itself, not just in relation to its value to human beings, as an international crime. It's still in a negotiation stage, let's put it this way. Do you think, would it have been in place? Would it have helped the cause to hold Russia to account for damages in the Ukraine, or is it another high threshold kind of international crime?
First of all, I think the threshold, if it is ever adopted, would be quite high. Second of all, as it is the case with a crime of aggression, Russia or other big powers, if we want to broaden the scope, would not subscribe to this amendment. Adding the so-called fifth international crime, ecocide, I don't envisage states, at least powerful militarily powerful states, to subscribe to these terms and thus to be bound by it. So I highly doubt it. Nevertheless, we have to mention that there is a provision on ecocide within the Ukrainian criminal code, and actually there are some pending cases by the office of the prosecutor, the Ukrainian office of the prosecutor, also relating to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and of course some cases which concern a factual matrix dating before the full-scale invasion of February 22, so as to document the long-term nature of the damage. So there are some pending investigations to this end, which I think reinforces the argument that for our purposes, the Ukraine-Russia armed conflict, the war of aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, it is not necessarily the case that we would need the fifth international crime enshrined within the statute of the International Criminal Court. Mm.
Moving back to the more practical and most precious situation of the war, first of all ending and then supporting Ukraine to rebuild, from reading your study, Leonard, it's pretty clear that the biggest share of CO2 emissions will come out of the reconstruction effort.
Yes.
So what is the most useful direction to think forward? What kind of support will Ukraine need to rebuild without boosting the CO2 levels even further? And what can international community, but also architects, civil society initiatives in European countries do to support the effort?
Well, you know, at the moment there are quite a lot of conferences and initiatives going on, you know, building back better and the green recovery of Ukraine, which is also very much supported by the president and the Ukrainian government. What is obvious will be that new buildings or renovated buildings will be very energy efficient, will have solar panels. And in fact, what we're doing now within Ukraine or within the European Union is to, you know, to make this Energiewende, the changing our energy system, can be done in Ukraine at a much quicker speed. However, what we also try to show with our study is that one thing is being overlooked at the moment, and that's the construction work itself, which is very energy and very CO2 intensive. We're talking about steel, we're talking about cement, and cement is, for example, from a CO2 perspective, a very polluting construction material. So what we also try to do as a next step in our study is to show what alternatives are available to make sure that those emissions will not happen. And for example, we can talk about bio-based building materials, like wood is, for example, a very popular building material, but also low-carbon cement, recycling cement, because there is an awful lot of debris available everywhere, or just taking out the steel from the cement would already help, because steel is very easy to recycle. So that's also something we are working on in see how we can avoid these emissions to happen. On the other hand, we have to be realistic. I mean, we're talking about such a huge reconstruction effort that you simply don't have, you know, it will take more time, it will be a bit more expensive. So I expect that the bulk of the reconstruction will still be done with traditional building materials, but even if we manage to have 20% of it low carbon, that's already a huge step forward. So I really hope, and again, you know, in terms of timing, we have to see an end to the war. But also for producers of these low-carbon construction materials, you know, they would have a huge market in Ukraine. So it would also be interesting to build a factory, you know, in Ukraine to start supplying this market, because from a business perspective, the market will be enormous.
That's what I'm thinking, and I think the level of organization from the top down all to the village level, I think Ukraine has given us a very impressive example what it means of effective coordination or getting organized, and for us it's really to jump in and just support the effort. And I think I would have hoped it's a matter of long-term preparation and planning, and I could only agree. For sure, it must be a business opportunity. The amount of material to be disposed of and rebuilt. So let's hope that enough people spot the opportunity. I've heard that Dutch architects are already making proposals for CO2 reconstruction efforts, etc.
But it's also interesting to see, if we're talking about renewable energy, that in Ukraine there is now really a drive in you know, having renewable energy, and not so much maybe from an environmental point of view, but from a security point of view. It's much more difficult to destroy distributed, you know, solar panels or wind farms that are distributed over the country than just targeting these 1, 2, 3 thermal power plants. So. And actually, I think we've been realizing that ourselves as well, that in the past we always said renewable energy is not reliable because it's not always windy, there's not always sun. Fossil fuel is much more reliable source of energy. I think now after this energy crisis, we realized it's the other way around.
On that note, I would like to invite you back on May 25th, because this will be the topic amongst our topics of discussion then. What, in the light of the current experience, how do we need to rethink security policies from an environmental perspective and an energy perspective in terms of foreclosing certain risks to appear in the first place, exploding energy prices for one, but also having nuclear power plants to become another battleground. This will be one of the topics next to the CO2 emissions, the carbon footprint of the military apparatus. Another big concern of us is, of course, if all these promises of Europe building up a new defense shield, reinvesting in its defense apparatus, that's goodbye to our climate goals, because the CO2 offshoot of this will be incredible. But where we stand at this will be discussed on May 25th. But at this point, I would like to say goodbye and thank you very much for joining us, to our viewers at home, and open the discussion to our audience. So please, any comments, any questions, we are happy to.